bias. The assumptions we make, the perspectives we carry, and how they shape the way we see other people and the world around us. But instead of trying to point fingers or say what's right or wrong, this space is about slowing things down, about having honest conversations, sharing real experiences, and trying to understand what lies beneath those first impressions. So whether you're here to reflect, to challenge your own perspective, or just to listen, you are welcome here. This is Beneath Bias, unveiling one story at a time.
Welcome to part 2 of the first Beneath Bias live show. A few weeks ago, many of you attended our live recording at Studenterhuset in Copenhagen, where we discussed sustainability, responsibility, and who bears the cost of Western greenwashing. The following episode is actually the Q&A from that show, where many of you came forward with questions or opinions on the matter that we discussed. It was really great to hear from all of you who had participated, and some of you who maybe challenged some of our own biases that we discussed in part 1. And we're very pleased to be able to share those contributions with our listeners who weren't in attendance that night. Regardless of who were there and who weren't, we still want to hear from those of you at home. So some of you may have seen that we posted a poll on our social media after release the last episode. And in it, we asked about your priorities concerning your own consumer habits. Now, in this poll, 23% of you said that sustainability is actually your main priority, and 62% of you told us that you prioritize it when you can. There's actually only 15% of you that said you rarely consider it. And I think these numbers really reflect a lot of the issues we discussed in the live show about internalizing responsibility and doing what we can when we can, but also putting into perspective the power of the individual and society as a collective. Now, as always, we love to hear from our listeners, so please stay tuned for similar polls in the future on both our social media and actually on Spotify. Sometimes if you look at the show notes, you can see that there's a poll where we might ask some questions, and we'd love to if you could fill that out. As we move into the summer months, we're going to be changing up our usual format just slightly. We'll still be recording shows as usual, but we'll be releasing some of our highlights from the roundtable at the Danish Science Festival that we recorded back in April, as well as some specially produced episodes by DDRN correspondents in Uganda and in Chile. So stay tuned for more Beneath Bias over the summer. For now, though, here's part 2 of our live show, Unmasking Greenwashing, the Cost of Sustainability in the Global South, with Associate Professor Stig Eduard Jensen. Enjoy.
I would like maybe to move to our audience. If you guys have some comment or some questions or something that you simply want to discuss, like from your daily basis.
Yeah, don't be shy and come here. Ask something or tell us whatever you feel.
So I have to pick it up.
Yeah, like a Taylor Swift, hold it.
Yeah. Guys, okay. What would you say to someone who's a bit more pessimistic maybe and thinks, I will get the silicon straw, I will do this, I will have my bag, but sometime, like right now, there's a billionaire out there who's taking a jet, and can I really do anything that has an impact, or is it being erased by the big sharks, I guess?
My stance is that, first of all, I think you should be conscious about what you are doing and be very much aware about you're doing, and then sort of saying, for example, one of the issues here that you sort of raise, and I know what I say now might feel a little bit controversial in a broader context here, is actually if you feel that you need to travel to somewhere, for example, flying to a place here, I think it's important that you do it. But I think it's also important to make some consideration when you do these things. For example, if possible, fly non-stop and doing these things here, because that's actually, if we look at sort of emission and all that, it actually means something going up and down. So I think that's something where you can think about, how can I do it in the best possible way? That's one thing I think you should be aware. And I also think you should actually consider also to pay some kind of compensation of what you are doing, and find out, are there actually any of these people who try to give you that service that are actually doing a very good job, not only for the environment, but actually also for people. That's one thing about yourself. then I think, and that's what I see with the activism here in not only Denmark, but EU, probably also in other places in the global north, I think we simply need to do something against this group of people who flying around in their private jets because their footprint is huge.
Yeah.
And the reason why why they can do these things is actually because we accept that they can do it. And also we need to be aware of the fuel is simply too cheap. But I think we simply need to find systems here. And I don't think we can get out of these things of maybe working with quotas and things like that. But I definitely think there's a low-hanging fruit in actually trying to sanction these people who are sort of flying a lot around and doing these things. And there I was not thinking particular on Taylor Swift, but I was actually thinking about other in the elites who are doing these things.
No, you are right. You're totally right. And the first thing we can do is, as you said, to say, I don't accept this. And this is a voice that it could be together with someone else on a different part of the world, and it could mean something.
Yeah, it's remind me like when I go to airports, like there's a people like maybe like a rich people with their dogs, and they use like a really good vehicle or something like that, and then I'm using my bikes. How can these animals like live more comfortable than me? Then sometimes it just like piss me off because I try to saving money and environments, but someone with their dogs and they using the private jets sometimes just like remind me to piss me off and just.
But I also want to sort of come back to your question also and sort of say, if we look at the sort of the global footprint in general, if we look at how much sort of air travel is actually, it's only a few percentage of the whole sort of CO2. So often we make this problem much bigger. And some problem we sort of overlook is, for example, when the US and Israel and Iran, for that sake, are sort of throwing bombs at each other. The whole production and the CO2 emission in relation to that is actually huge. So we're not talking about that they shouldn't do that because it's bad for the environment. But we should actually be much more active in these debates about how much, wars and these things actually also have. Because that footprint is so huge, so all of us could travel for hundreds of years and still not making the same footprint. So I think it's important we are sort of we're trying to navigate in these things here. So if you're skipping one flight here, the effect on the world is nothing. I'm sorry to say it. You can see the effect like I put my finger in this water. Where is the hole there? So I think we need to be aware of that it's actually important. So if you have to go home to families, friends, things, and have the money for it, do it. Because it actually makes yourself happy, other people happy, and that is important to be a citizen in the world with the possibilities that you have.
Okay, hello. First of all, thank you for organizing this event. And one example that you gave earlier really stuck with me with the supermarket run, so that we go to the supermarket and we have the decision between, let's say, conventional products or organically produced products. And my question comes to, what do we do when it comes to those structural problems? Because you mentioned that conventionally produced products are heavily subsidized by, let's say, the European Union. So what can we do to, change something about those structural problems? Because I guess if we go there and buy the organic products, that's great, and maybe we can inspire some people. But what do we do about the bigger problem?
Oh, that's a difficult question, because I think you're right that many of these structures that are in place at the moment is really, really difficult. Because I also think, just to explain, I'm not sort of answering your question, but I'm sort of trying to expand these things. I would say that the production structures of most countries in Africa is actually something that we have actually made for them. During colonial times, we found out it's really nice that they produce coffee, cotton, tobacco, tea, whatever here. And the problem here is actually that the price that these people that are working with these and the countries get it, is actually very little, because they still sort of produce all these raw materials for us, and they still get a very low price. But all these things like cars and other things is actually coming from here, and there's a lot of sort of all the work is actually here, all the jobs are here. So I think there's really something we need to do on the structural side here, and I think that's really, really difficult. And I think if we really want to change these things, we need to think about, could the Global South actually be a stronger actor? Could the Global South actually be better at sort of promoting their own agendas and changing things here? And there, I think, if, for example, the EU have a stronger counterpart in this discussion about where should things be produced and things like that, then I think there could be some changes. Mm-hmm. Actually, I see some changes going on. And most of those changes is actually because we in the Global North are so stupid. For example, many of the things that the Trump administration are doing at the moment in order to make US great again is actually doing exactly the opposite. Because it makes people to think about, no, we don't want them. So it might look good that you say these things, but I think you see it with the meeting between Putin and Xi, Russia's and Chinese leaders here. They're talking about that they want to make some changes here. I don't think these two leaders are heroes, but what I think is it would be really, really nice if these are going together. And what we see is that there is some of these things going on. There's something called BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who are actually trying to challenge our hegemony around these things here, because I think that's actually some of the things that are needed. But before we can do that, we also need to have voices here who sort of say we should change these things. We should change it, and also sort of saying we will not accept that we produce in Denmark 30 million pigs, for example, where most of the food is actually coming from soya that is produced in the Global South, and we don't pay anything for these things, but it destructs rainforest and other indigenous types of vegetation in these areas and create a lot of problems there. So we should also be, in our own context, sort of saying, we don't want these things. And also the other thing I think that is also very important, linked to this consumerism, is, do we need all these things that we buy? You know, and when we go to the supermarket, and these things are complicated, because I actually also think we should really also look at, you know, where are these things coming from? And I know some of you would sort of say, when you buy something from the Global South, of course there's a transport component, you know, in these things, and of course that have some impact. But I would actually prefer buying red wine from Chile, South Africa, instead of France or Italy, because I think it creates jobs and possibilities there. So it's also about being, you know, thinking about how can you actually, you know, diversify your way of doing things, and see it's actually more important to help with job creation and things like that in the Global South than it is actually to help it in for example, in a European context.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the point you raised on, if you need to travel somewhere to see your family, then just go and do it, or don't restrict yourself, and don't have anxiety to lead a more sustainable or lifestyle or with less environmental impact. But I think that's a quite dangerous statement to make, because then it leads everybody to say, I need to buy these, or I need to travel to these places. So then nobody makes a change, and then if nobody makes a change, there's no pressure on governments or markets. So when do these bigger stakeholders feel the pressure to change something?
I totally agree with you, and I also think it's important in that process when you sort of when you want to visit family or friends or whatever that is far away and you need to take a plane, that you have actually also have those considerations, whether you could go or not, because to get these things in the discourse is really important. The other element is that I think we should actually put a lot more pressure on states and also European Union actually to put taxes, CO2 taxes on these things, and actually also make as sort of the right prices in relation to these things here. But because it's really important that it's simply too cheap. And the reason why it's too cheap is because fuel and a lot of other things is heavily subsidized. So in that way, we are not paying the real price. And then some of you, and critique to me, could say, oh, but then it's only the rich who can fly. I know actually that in European Union, they are working, I know they're not very far in these things, about sort of a quota system. An individual quota system that actually say, you have a certain number of mileage that you can actually travel. And then some of you sort of say, it's unfair, all my family is in Canada, and so it's actually also to find out these things. But just that it's in the discourse that we are thinking about these things is actually really, really important. And maybe, this stupid war in the Middle East will help us in these things, because we are in a situation where very soon it'll be very difficult to get fuel for flying here. We already talk about it in the EU. Will it in the summer be sufficient so people can travel around during the summer here? But it could actually help us also when we have these limitations. We also think more creatively about, how do we cope with it? And should a sort of a standard family in Denmark actually fly 4 or 5 times a year? Is that a right? A human right or a planetary right? I don't think so.
Also, kind of answer this is always thinking of alternatives. I mean, a plane is also an option, but there are so many other things that you could choose to do so. It could be your last option. It could be the option that you choose eventually, but you have to think alternatively in a lot of aspects, and I would have agreed with you totally.
I just want to add something here. There's an article in one of the bigger Danish newspapers called Politiken today of that domestic flights have increased, or domestic travel by airplane have increased with more than 30% since the corona crisis. It's just saying something about, in a country like Denmark that is so small, why is it so many people should actually take a flight in order to get around here? And our other problem here in Europe, it's not only in Denmark, is why don't we, I know the French have, but why don't we have these high-speed trains that they have in Japan and China and things like that? Then it will be really fast to go from big cities within Europe and in a more environmental friendly way. It's so important that we think much more creatively about this and make this public transportation much better.
That is true, but this is why I believe the state is a much of a bigger actor than I am. I have the mindset. Do you disagree?
But it's
just
okay
to raise conversation,
But it's okay to be disagree.
Yeah, it's okay, guys. We were talking before that it's okay to disagree with us to everything. But I do agree that it has so much power than me, but it doesn't have still the same goal as I have. Everyone, my government, other government is seeing still the GDP, and I think we should take the GDP and throw it out of the window someday.
It's a good idea. But I also think in that context, although I've voted, we have had a lot of referendums about EU here. I've voted no at all of them, apart from the last one. I think a strong EU can actually make a change.
Yeah.
And I know in many ways in Spain they're very frustrated because they're actually very progressive in some ways and we are very slow going in other areas. But if we, as an EU, a big sort of alliance of countries, actually take this decision, it can have some really positive effects. And we have seen it on, for example, paternity leave and things like that, that suddenly things are changing because they are doing some regulations. So I think it's not only on the individual level, on the state level, we actually need sort of other at a broader, and EU will be good. It will also be really nice if we had a UN that could actually be really, really strong on these things. And I think we should actually have some institution that can make decisions that states have to follow.
Yeah, good ideas. We can start something today. Any other questions, guys?
Thank you so much, guys. Super interesting chat. The first thing actually would be in response to the thing about civil liberties and, restricting individuals. I think as soon as you make an argument for that, people will not support it. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that sort of the top percentage of the world and the corporations equate for much of the damage. However, that's also into what you were saying before. It's not an account for nihilism. It's not an account for individual responsibility. And I tend to think, much like you, quite extreme. If I can't do everything, then it feels like I'm doing nothing. But I don't think we can be reductionist in that. I think to give quite a tangible example, and I was listening to a podcast just today actually that said when it concerns the environment, it concerns all of us. And I just moved recently to the lakes area, so I walk around there every day, and it's breeding season for the birds. And what minimal nature there is, I'm from Australia, what minimal nature there is here in Denmark is not appreciated. There's no reverence for it, at least from what I can tell. And maybe not no reverence, but it concerns all of us that those nests that the birds are making are full of plastic. It concerns all of us that we should be taking individual responsibility to pick up our rubbish or to tell that person in front of us who just dropped their cigarette butt that that's not okay and that does affect all of us. So it's just a statement, but I actually think that I would go against what you said maybe about internalizing issues and say, actually, no, I think we need to have more appreciation for nature and be a bit more passion and motivation, and a bit of maybe guilt and shame wouldn't go astray when it comes to that.
I think it's nice that you sort of challenge me, and I actually just want to say that unfortunately I agree with you. Actually, as I said to some here, I'm a very keen bird watcher myself. So I come, although I just live in an apartment, that's also more environmental friendly than actually living in a house. And I also don't have a summer house, just to sort of say. But I come out very, very sort of often in nature. And two things I would like to say is actually there's a process going on in Denmark that I think is very positive. You see it also in other European countries, of these things around rewilding. So what we actually see, we've been aware of that there's actually a lot of problems here. But at the same time, we are one of the few countries where we actually shoot indigenous people, not indigenous people, but indigenous biodiversity. For example, although it's not allowed in EU, we shoot wolves, for example. Also, if you just go out to this very nice area with so-called nature we have here, called Vestamager, they also shoot the foxes there, and they also kill the young foxes there because they say that they have negative impact on the birds there. Because unlike in Australia, nature here in Denmark are small islands. It's really in either urban areas or heavily intensified agricultural land. So it's a really, really big problem. I think people are becoming aware of these things, and we should be aware of at the Biodiversity COP15 in Montreal a couple of years ago. We actually agree, all countries in the world agreed that we have a biodiversity crisis. And in my point of view, the biodiversity crisis is much deeper and much more dangerous than the climate crisis. Just to sort of make that clear, that in 2030, 30% of the land should actually be protected. Mm-hmm. In Denmark, if we take out, Greenland here, it's less than 1%. And those areas we call national parks, they're not living up to the international standards of national parks. So now we are trying to create something new we call nature national parks, which are sort of also a little bit sort of dubious, I think. So there's a lot of these challenges here. And just to make you a little bit disappointed, not only you, but all of you here, one of the challenges related to these things, and also the first part of your interventions, is actually democracy is a challenge here. Because we like democracy, we think it's fantastic, but it's actually, to do the right thing here, it's really difficult for a government to do that, because then at the next election they'll be voted out because people don't want these things. So if you sort of limit individual freedom and make things much more expensive. In that way, it's much easier for Xi in China They can make 50-year programs and they can actually do something. And I know it's challenged some of you, but I actually spent 1 year in China in the late 1980s. And at that time, there was so much environmental destruction. And I would actually say that they were eating everything with 4 legs apart from chairs and tables here. It was so widespread. Now, I went to one of these places in Sichuan province where they have a national park for pandas that is bigger than Denmark. And, so they have actually done a lot of these things. They have made actually a lot of sort of transformation. So it's possible. I'm not trying to say that China is sort of a dream society. I see there's a lot of problems, and in particular in relation to democracy, human rights, and things like that. But I'm actually saying that it is possible. And I think one of the important things for a podcast like this is it is possible. And I think Johan Rockström, who is really one of the key people within sustainable development, he is at one of these institutes in Potsdam in Germany, but he's originally a Swede. He would say, we can still make those changes here, so the planet will also be livable in the future. The problem is that we're simply too slow. So that's the reason why younger generation, we simply need to say we don't want to listen to older people like us, and we don't want to accept that we continue with individualistic overconsumption here, which means that the 20th of March, which is actually my birthday, we have used what we, of the resources in the world, what was actually our part for the whole year. So just sort of saying, we need to get out of these things.
Yeah.
Can I tack on one thing? Just to the side note of that, is there then a place beside human rights for nature rights to legalize that?
I think there are. But, the problem is, and that's many of these things with the rights issue, is that maybe in societies like Australia or EU, there will actually be some who can sanction these things. But in many places in the global south, the situation is that states are very weak. So we could sort of try to say, okay, and they have they have signed a lot of these, international agreement, but they have never implemented it. So that's a challenge here. Is actually who are really doing these things. And I think there's some interesting things going on from these. UN have just agreed, General Assembly of these things about that we actually have a responsibility for these emissions here in relation to these low-lying islands. So I think there's something going on here, but I think, it will only be sanctioned in well-institutionalized countries.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, for the questions and for coming here. We came to an end of this podcast with a lot of interesting arguments, I would say. You can stay tuned in Spotify and YouTube and subscribe to our channels. If you like us, please give us a review on Spotify and tell your friends about us. This has been Beneath Bias, unveiling one story at a time. Thank you.